Alright, so welcome to this module on graphs, which is I believe part of your advanced data structures and algorithms course. In this module, I am going to quickly review some of the things that you may have done already so that I can bring you into my definitions and my context of what I am covering in this module. So if you have seen some of this material before, just bear with the first 15 or 20 minutes while I revisit some of the things which are basic definitions of graphs and things like that. So before I start talking about graphs, graph algorithms, graph data structures, I want to spend a few minutes discussing how graphs fit into the study of algorithms and data structures. Alright, why are we so interested in graphs and the representations when we study algorithms and data structures? And in order to see that, just let me tell you a little bit about how we pose problems for algorithms and data structures and what we do with it. So before we start looking for an algorithm for a problem, we have to first understand what the problem is. And in order to understand this problem, you typically look for certain what are called prototype problems. Some problems that you have already worked on for which you know the algorithm, you know the data structure, and then you check whether your given problem matches the prototype problem. This is very similar to what we do in every engineering discipline. Somebody is constructing a bridge, for example, you'll ask, okay, this looks very much like that bridge that we constructed there. Somebody is building a house. You'll say, what kind of house is it? 2-story house, 3-story house? It looks very similar to that house that we have constructed earlier, so we can start with that as the basis, right? Similarly, in electrical engineering, you will have prototype circuits which you will use as a basis to start designing a new circuit. Similarly, also in algorithms, your prototype problems that basically for which the algorithms have been discovered, and then you try and see whether your problem can be mapped or modeled using that prototype problem, or if you need a variation. If you need a variation, then you look for a variation. So once you have, so graphs basically provide one type of prototype problem, which I'll come to. Once you have identified what kind of a problem you have, then you can start looking at the algorithmic technique you will use for solving that problem. For instance, you have these kinds of techniques, of which a few we will discuss in this particular graph module. So you have divide and conquer, which is one very standard method which all of you might know, to do binary sort of a list of numbers. For example, you could use divide and conquer. You divide the list into two halves and you sort each of the halves and then you put the halves together. That's called divide and conquer. Or you can use, you have this another class of algorithms which is called greedy. So in greedy, you look for the best solution locally, and then you try to construct your global solution by using these locally optimal solutions. And I will show you the use of greedy for graph, one of the graph problems tomorrow, and you will get an idea of how greedy algorithms work. The third method that you will probably see in your data structures course as we go along later on in the course is dynamic programming. Okay, probably you have not looked at it so far, but later on in the course you will come into dynamic programming. In this particular module, we will look at the use of dynamic programming for again doing a specific kind of graph problem. And finally, there is this class of solutions which are called network flow solutions or network flow algorithms, which again are used to do model problems which involve capacity and maximizing use of a specific amount of capacity. So network flow. So these are different kinds of algorithmic techniques, standard techniques you might say. So once you know what your prototype problem is, you can ask yourself, can any of these standard methods of doing algorithms, can they work? Will a greedy algorithm work here? Will a dynamic programming problem algorithm be required over here, or whatever? Okay. And once you have your algorithmic technique, that is when your data structure really comes in. Okay. We will look at it in more detail as we go into today's lecture. But once you know your algorithmic technique, you know the basic operations you need in order to do your algorithm. And then you ask yourself, in order to do these basic operations, what kind of a data structure you need, right? To do these basic operations efficiently, what kind of a data structure do you need? And that is why there is this notion which is called abstract data type that is introduced. So what is an abstract data type? An abstract data type basically is a set of values. For example, you can say a set of nodes in a graph or a set of integers or whatever, or these are your set of values, and the set of operations that are permitted on these set of values. Okay, what operations are allowed? For example, for a list of numbers, I might want to find the minimum of this list of numbers. I might want to find the maximum of this list of numbers. I might want to find the average of this list of numbers. So these could be the operations. So I am saying basically that my basic values are numbers, and the operations that I want to do is find the min, find the max, and find the average. Let's say. Okay. So once you know the values, the operations that you want to perform on the values, and what behavior these operations have, then you can try and design a data structure that is most efficient for doing those particular operations. Okay. So it's very important that you don't start with data structure a priori. It doesn't make sense. Just starting with a data structure on day one and just, okay, I am interested and I'm just start doing some data structure, that doesn't make sense. You have to first ask yourself what is the problem, then you have to ask yourself this problem, what kind of algorithm works for this problem, what kind of primitive steps are required for this algorithm, and in order to do those primitive steps efficiently, what kind of data structure you need, alright. And there are some again standard in some sense data structures that we will come across again and again in the study of algorithms and data structures. Arrays and lists are well known data structures. Queues and stacks again are just built using arrays and lists, and they allow you to do certain additional operations on these lists or arrays. Then there are these data structures called heaps, which allow you to do some more operations. We will discuss heaps in tomorrow's class a little bit. And then there are binary trees, which are another kind of data structure, and so on. So these are the kind of data structures. You have other more interesting data structures like Fibonacci heaps and various things like that. But you can define the data structure according to what you need in some sense. In some sense, there is no limit to the number of data structures you can construct, but usually these kind of data structures like stacks, heaps, queues, and binary trees are usually enough to do a variety of different types of things. So once you have your algorithm, you have your basic steps, you have your data structure which allows you to do those basic steps efficiently, you can get into this business of doing analysis. Usually there are two kinds of analysis you want to do for every problem. One analysis is to show that your problem is modeled, your algorithm is efficient. Efficient means that it is going to do it with a number of steps in terms of time. It's going to do it with a number of steps which is very low, as low as possible in fact. Okay. And the other is that it uses a minimum amount of memory, as little memory as is possible, right. So complexity of the algorithm is defined in terms of time, which means how many steps it will take, or in terms of space, which means how much memory it will take. But a more important part of the analysis is to show your algorithm is correct. In fact, I have seen many times when I teach data structure algorithms to students in IIT, for example, students come up with algorithms which are very efficient, but they are often wrong. Okay, they don't work in all the cases. Creating algorithms that are efficient but don't work is worse than not creating an algorithm, right? It's worse than creating an algorithm that is not efficient. You got to make sure your algorithm is correct first. There is no point in having algorithms which work for some cases, don't work for some cases, and are extremely efficient. There is no use at all, okay? Because it might turn out that your data set which is given to you for your problem might actually belong to that class of things for which your algorithm does not work. So your algorithm has to firstly be correct. So when you do your analysis, you must check that the algorithm that you have developed is correct, and there are standard techniques usually that are used for checking correctness of algorithms. They are usually based on induction techniques, right, induction methods, and we will not have time to discuss correctness too much in this module because we don't have enough time. But any discussion on algorithm and data structures is not complete unless you can get into correctness proofs, where you can actually check out that what you have developed is completely correct for all possible. So where does graph sit in all this? So graphs basically is something that contributes to every one of these four boxes. Okay, so graph gives you a set of prototype problems to work on. So when we talk about, for example, shortest path problems, network flow problems, when we talk about finding coloring problem or any of these kinds of standard prototype problems, we are discussing graph problems, but you will find these kind of problems present in many disciplines. So many different kinds of things that we look at can be modeled in terms of graphs and problems on graphs, which is why graphs give rise to a very large number of prototype problems and variations, and therefore studying graphs and the algorithms and graphs helps you to solve a large number of different problems in real life. And in graphs again you can use any of these different types of techniques, divide and conquer technique, greedy algorithms, dynamic programming or network flow, and data structures like arrays, lists, queues, stacks, heaps, binary trees are all used in graph algorithms. And obviously you will discuss complexity and you will discuss correctness for graph algorithm. And if you can do the correctness and complexity of a graph algorithm, and if you do it, if you can prove it, then it becomes a lot easier to do a real life problem, because all you have to do is model that real life problem as a graph problem. And since you already solved this graph problem, you have now solved the real life problem. You don't have to go and rediscover the complexity of this real life problem. You don't have to rediscover the correctness of this real life problem and so on. Okay. Typically, the parameters that we use to measure complexity of graph problems involves two kinds of things: the number of nodes, which usually we denote by n, and the number of edges, which we denote by m. Okay. So in order to understand what is n and m are, you obviously have to know what a graph is, which most of you know anyway, but I am just going to repeat it with some examples, right. So imagine that you have a real life problem where you are given a map of a country or a region of the country, and you are asked to color it. Okay, you are asked to color it. Color it means what? A political map of a country is divided into states. You need to color these states in such a way that neighboring states have different colors. Okay. So how do you solve this problem? How do you ensure that you can color this map in a way where the neighboring states have different colors, but at the same time you can use as little colors as possible to color the map? This is the problem that we have. It's called the coloring problem. In order to do this problem, what we can do is we can model the states by using nodes. Right. So I put a dot in each of these states, and that represents, each of these dots represents a node of the graph. And then what I can say basically is that if two states have a boundary, that is, they have an edge, they have a common boundary, right, between them, then I put an edge between those states. So for example, Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh have a boundary, and therefore I can put an edge between them. Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan also have a boundary, so I can put an edge between them, and so on. So like this I can put edges, and so I get this graph, right. So this is a graph where the nodes represent the states of the country, and the edges represent basically the fact that the two states have a common boundary. And you are saying basically that we need to color the states with colors in such a way that basically no two states which have a common boundary will have the same color. So what we are saying basically is that since we have represented states by nodes now, and we have represented by edges the fact that two states have a common boundary, saying basically that no two states which are next to each other or having a common boundary will have the same color, basically is the same as saying that no two nodes which are connected by an edge will have the same color. Is that okay? Does it make sense? So basically what we are saying in this graph coloring problem is that I have to color the states in such a way that no two nodes which share an edge, which have an edge in between them, will have the same color. Now note that in order to solve this problem now, the map itself is irrelevant. I can throw the map away now. This is what we do when we convert problems to graphs, right? We represent the problem using graph. So in this case I have represented the states as nodes. I represented the fact that two states have a common boundary by an edge, and the problem by saying that I should color all the nodes with different colors in such a way that no two nodes which are connected by an edge have the same color. I have modeled it like this. Once I have done this, I have taken all the information I need from the map and put it in my graph. I don't need the map anymore. So I can throw the map away and I can just keep the graph and I can do the problem on the graph, right. So this is how we simplify real life problems in some sense. You take all the values that you need from the real life world and you put it into your graph problem, and once you have done that, you throw away the real life problem, and now you have a graph problem to work with. Okay. So in this case we have a graph which has nodes and edges. This is a specific kind of a graph which is called a planar graph. Okay, graphs which are made from regions which are real world regions like boundaries with boundaries and so on. You get graphs which have planar. Planar basically means I can place these nodes of the graph on a plane, and I can place these edges also on the plane in such a way that no two edges overlap with each other. So clearly, obviously here you can see that this graph, no two edges are overlapping with each other, right. So a planar graph is a graph in which the graph's nodes can be put on a plane and the edges can be put on the plane in such a way that no two edges are overlapping each other. Okay. So graphs that are obtained from maps basically will always be planar graphs, clearly be planar graphs. Now there is a theorem which is there about planar graphs which says that every planar graph can be colored with at most 4 colors. Not a very easy theorem to prove. It took a very long time to prove this theorem, alright, in the world of graphs, but there is a theorem like that which comes to our aid. Of course, You can ask what is the big deal. I mean, I can color the graph with 5 enough colors, right? It's not that we are short of colors. I have 5 colors, I can have 6 colors also. We have a palette full of colors. So just because I reduced it from 6 to 5 or 5 to 4, it's not a big deal. But nevertheless, this is an interesting theorem, okay, that you can color every graph with planar graph with 4 colors. Therefore, with only 4 colors are enough for me to do this problem, okay. But I can use 5 also, I can use 6 also, but it's nice to know basically that I can do it with 4. Now, there are many applications of this graph coloring problem, okay, graph coloring problem. For example, in compilers, there is this problem which is called register allocation, which says basically that I need to allocate variables in your program to registers, and I want to do it in such a way basically that the two registers, the say two variables are not stored in a register. If the two variables are required by somebody at the same time, then in that case that register is conflicting, right? So you get something called a conflict graph you can make out of the thing, that is you can take all the conflicts and you can represent a graph out of it. So variables represent nodes, conflicts represent edges, and then you have to color the nodes in such a way basically that no two nodes which are conflicting are sharing the same variable. So the number of colors represents the number of registers. Okay, so this is called the register allocation problem for graphs, and that models into a graph coloring problem. Of course, this problem may not turn out to give you graphs which are planar in nature. They will usually be non-planar in nature, and therefore you will need more than 4 colors, many more colors than 4 you may need in order to solve this problem. Okay, but and this problem is not very easy to solve also. It's not very easy to solve this problem. All right, but this is an example which is used quite a lot. Coloring is an example which is used, but we are not going to be discussing graph coloring in this module. Okay, but we are going to discuss a different kind of problem called shortest path problem in this module, and for that the prototype thing that we are looking at really is airline routing, for example, or train routing or car routing or any kind of routing problem. So what is a routing problem? I take the same map of India. I have now, instead of states, I look at cities. So I have Delhi, I have Chennai, I have Bombay, I have Varanasi and Trivandrum and so on. These are the cities I have, and I want to ask myself, is there a way for me to fly, for example, from Chennai to Varanasi using the least number of hops? Okay, the least number of hops, which means I don't want to keep changing planes too often. Maybe with 2 changes I want to go from Chennai to Varanasi. Is it possible for me to do that? This is the question I am asking. Okay, or I want to do another problem. I will say I want to go from Chennai to Varanasi, but I want to do it by spending the least amount of money, right? So I know the fares of the different legs. So I want to choose the legs in such a way that the total sum of the total amount of fare is the minimum. So I get the lowest ticket cost for going from Chennai to Varanasi. So these are different kinds of problems, which are all problems which are routing problems, right? Where we are trying to figure out how to go from one place to another, one city to another, where the cities are connected, neighboring cities are connected by flights, right? Flights. So nodes are cities here, which are called stops in some sense also, and edges are flights. An edge is directed if there is a flight going from Chennai to Bangalore, for example, there is a directed edge going from Chennai to Bangalore. If there is a flight going from Bangalore to Chennai also, you will have an edge from Bangalore to Chennai, right? So you will have 2 edges, one from Chennai to Bangalore, another from Bangalore to Chennai, and in that case, you have, because you have edges in both directions, then you can basically model this kind of graph by using what is called an undirected graph. Okay, so the problem we are trying to solve here is, prototype problem we are trying to solve here is what is called the single source shortest path problem. How do I go with the shortest number of hops from Chennai to Varanasi, which is basically the shortest number of edges from Chennai to Varanasi? It's called the single source shortest path problem, right? And we'll discuss this tomorrow's class. When we have flights in between every pair of cities, if you have flights in both directions, then you may not want to show the direction. So if I have a flight from Bombay to Kolkata and Kolkata to Bombay, then I don't need to show the direction. I just draw an undirected edge between 4 and 5, and usually undirected edge means that there is a directed edge in this direction, or there is a directed edge in the other direction. So we don't need to write the direction at all, right? So we just write an undirected edge. This is an undirected graph, which means basically that I have basically modeled this in a way where every city to every other city there are flights going in both directions. Sometimes it's not like that, right? We know basically that there are these multi-hop flights. So for example, there may not be a flight going from Delhi to Varanasi. There may be only a flight going from Varanasi to Delhi. So there will be Bombay, Varanasi, Delhi, Bombay. Flight will go from Bombay to Varanasi, Varanasi to Delhi, and then it will come back to Bombay. So if I want to go from Delhi to Varanasi, I have to go Delhi to Bombay and then I have to go Bombay to Varanasi, right? Maybe like that. But in this example I am considering, I assume basically that every flight goes in both directions, so I can do undirected graph, right? I can do an undirected graph because flights go in both directions. So we have a very simple definition of graph. A graph consists of nodes, or many times called vertices. In fact, in all my slides I have used vertices, but interchangeably we may use nodes to represent the vertices of the graph. So graph consists of vertices V and edges E. V is the set of vertices or nodes, E is a set of edges which is a subset of V cross V. An edge, basically a V comma V prime, is a directed edge which goes from V to V prime. If the graph is undirected, basically, then if V prime belongs to the edges, then V prime V also belongs to edges, right? So if there is an edge from V to V prime, then edge from V prime to V also in the graph, then the graph is said to be undirected. A path, which is what we will be interested in the graph, is from U to V, is a sequence of vertices V1 to Vn with U equal to V1, V equal to Vn, such that each Vi plus 1 is an edge in the graph, okay, which means I can go from U to V through edges of the graph. That is what it means. A path is said to be simple if all the vertices in the path are distinct, otherwise it is not simple, okay. So you can actually, in a typical path, you can go back to the same vertex. So I can go from V1 to V2 to V3, come back to V2, go to V4, V5, come back to V1, go to V6, V7 and then go to V8, right? I can do that. That is allowed in path, okay. But a path which is simple is a path which has distinct vertices. So we are not restricting that the path does not come back to the same vertex, but when you do shortest paths, typically you will not come back to the same vertex because it does not make sense to do it. Because if you come back to the same vertex and go somewhere, you might as well not have gone somewhere and come back to the same vertex, right? So for shortest paths, simple paths are usually enough. But there are many problems where simple paths are not enough to consider. So when we talk about complexity of graphs, typically we are using two parameters. One parameter is the number of nodes in the graph and the other parameter is the number of edges in the graph. Remember that I said n is the number of nodes, m is the number of edges. So when we talk about the complexity, you are using these two parameters n and m, and you can write the complexity in terms of n and m. Typical graph complexity comes out as, I hope you all know what this order notation means. I am not going to repeat it. It basically means asymptotically it becomes n plus m. For large values of n and m, it becomes like n plus m, right? So asymptotically it approaches n plus m. So graphs can be graph algorithms can typically be order n, they can be order m, they can be order n plus m, right? Now why are we writing order n plus m? Because m may not be related, it may not be easy to relate m in terms of n. M can be order n. If m is order n, then order n plus m is just order n, okay. M may be order n square, in which case order n plus m is order n square, alright. M may also be somewhere between n and n square, it may be n log n for example, in which case we have order m, which is order n log n. So your algorithm might be order n plus m, order n square, order n times m, and so on. Typically these are the kind of complexities that you get for graph algorithm, alright. Now we look at two representations of graphs and then immediately I am going to ask you some questions to figure out whether you understood this representation thing. You can represent graphs in two ways typically. There are many ways of representing graphs, but there are two ways of representing graphs that are typically used in most algorithm studies of graphs. And the first method is by representing the graph using a matrix, okay. So you use a matrix called the adjacency matrix where Aij, so the nodes are represented by numbers. So you say the nodes are numbered 1 to n, and then you say basically that an edge therefore will be a pair of numbers I and j, I comma j, and you say basically that Aij is 1, right? Aij is 1 if there is an edge between I and j, and Aij is 0 otherwise. So you get a matrix, you get a matrix. So the matrix basically, if it is undirected, then the matrix will be symmetric. If it is not undirected, then the matrix may not be symmetric. So for example, here is an adjacency matrix of this graph that we considered, the airline routing problem. I have 10 nodes here, so therefore I have 10 rows and I have 10 columns, and then 2 comma 1 says basically that there is an edge between 2 and 1, right? This edge 2 and 1, 2 and 1, right? So that's what 2 comma 1 says. So A21 is equal to 1 because there is an edge between 2 and 1, but A24 is 0 because there is no edge between 2 and 4. Okay, that is what it's saying. So you can very easily represent a graph. It's a very easy representation. Just use a matrix. Of course, this matrix is going to be large. It's going to be of size which is n square, right, because we are using nodes and edges are both going to have number which is n. Therefore, we have n square elements in this matrix. But you may have a compressed way. You can compress this matrix and store it in a more compact form and use it and so on. So order n square may not be bad. But assume for a moment that the number of nodes in this graph is very large. For example, we are trying to model a graph between all human beings in the world, right? Facebook, for example, tries to make a graph, friends graph between all the people, right? Everybody and their friends are connected by an edge. So how many nodes do we have? Facebook has 1 billion or more subscribers. I don't know how many do you have, but it's in billions. So you have 1 billion nodes, and if you want to represent it by an adjacency matrix, then what are you going to have? You are going to have 1 billion multiplied by 1 billion sized adjacency matrix. That is 10 to the 9 into 10 to the 9, 10 to the 18 sized adjacency matrix. Your computer will just give up trying to represent it. Okay. So some problems which are very large, where the number of nodes is very large, obviously this method of representation is not going to work, right? You can't represent it like this at all. But when the number of nodes is small, for example, register allocation problem we discussed, where we are trying to model the variables in a program by as nodes and all that, or states of India we want to model as nodes. The number of nodes are small, it's in the order of tens or so, and so it's very easy to model this using a graph with adjacency matrix. Alright, so it's clear that the neighbors of a specific node in an adjacency matrix are all represented by the row. So if I take the node 4 for example, to find out the neighbors of 4, I just have to scan the row. So I look at the row 4, I see a 1 in 1, so 1 is a neighbor. I see a 1 in 5, so 5 is a neighbor. I see a 1 in 8, so 8 is a neighbor. So I can see that 1, 5 and 8 are neighbors of 4. So in order to find the neighbors of a specific node, I have to scan a row, and scanning a row in a matrix takes how much time? It takes order n time, because there are n rows, n columns, right? So therefore you have to do order n operations. So therefore order n time is taken in an adjacency matrix to locate all the neighbors, and that might be not good idea, right? It may be too much, so we may look at ordinary representation. But if we have to check whether I and j are neighbors, like if I want to check whether 4 and 6 are neighbors, they are not, right? All I have to do is to go and look at this entry in the matrix 4, 6, I find that entry has value 0. So checking whether something is a neighbor of something takes constant time in adjacency matrix. Okay, so this is the thing that to keep in mind. If you are going to do neighbor checking, then it's faster with adjacency matrix. But if you are going to do something with all the neighbors, that is slow with adjacency matrix. Okay. Now consider the other kind of representation. This representation is called adjacency list representation. Here what are we doing? We are saying we will maintain a list of all the neighbors of a node. So 1's neighbors are 2, 3, 4, 2's neighbors are 1, 3, 3's neighbors are 1, 2, like this we are maintaining. Okay. So for each vertex we are maintaining the list. So we are maintaining a list, not an array, but a list of neighbors. So scanning neighbors is very easy now, because if I want to find the neighbors of 4, I just look in this list, 1, 5 and 8 is given to me. So finding all the neighbors of a node is very easy now. I have to just look at the list and pick up all the neighbors. But if I want to check whether two nodes are neighbors of each other, I comma j, is I a neighbor of j? If I want to find out, this is not easy to do now, right? Why? Because to check whether j is a neighbor of I, let's say I want to find out whether 6 is a neighbor of 4. How do I do that? I go to 4, then I check whether 6 is there in this list. So I have to check whether first element is not 6, second element is not 6, third element is not 6. I have no elements left in the list. Therefore 6 is not in the list. Therefore 6 is not a neighbor of 4. So I have to scan all the neighbors of 4 to find out whether 6 is a neighbor of 4. So checking whether ij is a neighbor is not constant time, depends on the size, the number of neighbors of a node. Okay, whereas in the adjacency matrix that was constant time. All right. So given this rather simple definition of adjacency matrix and list that I gave you, I am going to ask a question to you, and feel free to, anybody can raise your hand and try to answer it. I have an example here. First example, this example says graph degree of a vertex of a graph. Degree of a vertex of a graph is defined as basically the number of edges incident on that vertex. For example, the degree of 1 is 3 because there are 3 edges. Degree of 3 is 2 because there are 2 edges. Degree of 5 is 3, and so on. The maximum degree of a graph right, is the maximum value of the degree of the nodes of the graph. So in this case it's very easy, visually you can see that node 6 has the maximum degree because it has 4 edges. All the other nodes seem to have only 3 edges. So 6 is the one which has maximum degree, and the maximum degree value for the graph is 4 in this graph. Okay. Now question for you is, which representation, adjacency matrix or adjacency list, is better to find the maximum degree of a graph? I want to find the maximum degree of a graph. Would I use adjacency matrix representation or would I use adjacency list representation? Okay, question. Anybody can answer. So feel free to ask your local person there to raise hand, and you can take the mic and answer it. All right. So somebody should raise hand. Okay, somebody here has raised hand. So let's ask GECKA.
Sir, it should be an adjacency list because
Okay.
you just have to do an order n operation. For the other one, you will have to do an order n square operation.
Why is it order
n adjacency
matrix? Why is it order n square for matrix?
Because for finding out the answer, you will have to go through every row of the matrix.
Okay.
And you will have to check which all are ones. But in the other one, we are keeping a list.
Okay. So
but
what is
in the other one,
complexity of maximum degree according to you? For finding the complexity of maximum degree, what will it be if you use adjacency list?
Order n, because you only have to traverse the entire list, and there the number might be less compared to the other one, because you
have to go through all the nodes, you have to sort the nodes, so there is some amount of sorting work that has to be done, right, which can take n log n time. Sorting will take n log n time,
which can n log n time.
For each node you have to find the maximum degree, so you have to find all the neighbors of the node, and so that is order E time. So the complexity of this problem, and you can look at this on your own, is going to be order E, because you have to look at all the edges, somewhere you have to look at all the edges, right. So it's order E on one side and order n log n because you have to sort the list of maximum values. Okay. All right, very good, very good. All right, this is very good. So next, so this is for this, you obviously you shouldn't use matrix because order n square. You should, for order n square operation, just to find the maximum values of the just to find the degree of all the nodes, and then after that you have to sort these degrees, which will take n log n time. So n log n plus n square, so n square is the complexity if you use matrix. So you should use list here. Okay, so the next problem, all right, next problem, example 2, I am defining something called a clique or a complete subgraph is a subset C of the vertices of G such that for each pair of vertices in the clique C, UV is an edge of the graph, which means it's a subset of the graph, subset of nodes of the graph, which is such that inside the clique all the pairs of nodes are connected. Get it? So for example, a clique of size 3 will be a triangle, because a triangle all the nodes are connected, right. A clique of size 4 will basically be a rectangle where both the diagonals are drawn. Rectangle with both triangles drawn, all the nodes are connected. So that will be a clique of size 4. So like that. So a clique of size n, basically a clique of size k, is a subset of size of k vertices where all the pairs of nodes are connected by an edge. Now if you want to find out whether a subset X is a clique or not, which representation would you use? Would you use adjacency list or would you use adjacency matrix? Would you use adjacency list to find a clique, or would you use adjacency matrix? So any of you can answer this question, so please raise hand and you can take the mic and answer. So KNMU is saying basically matrix. They are saying matrix. Any of you think anything else different from matrix? KNMU is saying matrix. I want to know why actually. Why are they saying matrix? KNMU, why are you saying matrix? You want to raise hand, then you can interact. Why are you saying matrix? Why do you think it's matrix? Okay. So there are some people are saying list, some people are saying matrix. All right. Some people are saying list, some people are saying matrix. So why is it a list? Why is it a matrix? Is anybody who wants to argue for matrix? Want to come online? Why is it? Why do you say it's a matrix? Why do some people think it's a list? We should use list for this clique problem. Okay, it is easy to find out clique in matrix. This is what is being said by KNMU. Why is that? Why is that? The answer is that is the correct answer. It is easy to find out clique in matrix. But why is that? Because to check whether something is a clique, what you have to do is you have to check whether every pair of vertices in the clique is an edge or not. Okay, and to check whether a pair of vertices is an edge or not is easier to do in a matrix. So if you have a clique of size k, I have to do only order k operations in the adjacency matrix, whereas if I have to do adjacency list, I may have to do many more operations to find out whether those k vertices are connected or not. Okay, which is why it's easier to find the adjacency of particular nodes in matrix is what is being said by a lot of people. Excellent. Okay, so for this example, so it's easy to see that you can see for yourself therefore that just because list is a more easy way to traverse neighbors doesn't mean list is better. Depends on the operations. Okay, depends on the operations. So depending on your graph algorithm that you want to do, you have to choose the data structure. Operations that you have to choose your data structure. If your operation requires you to do finding out whether two nodes are neighbors many times, then it's better to go with matrix. If your graph algorithm requires you to do things with the neighbors, it's better to do list. Okay, so once we understand that, we can then move to the topic which is really part of what we wanted to cover in the lecture today, which is graph traversal. All right, graph traversal. So there are two kinds of graph traversals we are going to talk about: breadth first traversal of the graph and depth first traversal of the graph. And I am going to discuss basically in today's class what kind of properties of the graph breadth first and depth first discovers, and how can we use this discovery of these graph properties of breadth first that we find out by using breadth first and depth first. How can we use it to solve certain problems on graphs? Okay, that's what we're going to do in today's class. So for that I need to help you understand this breadth first and depth first properly. Okay, you should understand it properly, very well. So let's take this example problem again, which is this list of cities and airline routes between the cities. Let's say we want to go from Chennai, which is in this case it's the node 9 in this graph, to Varanasi, which is node 3 in this graph. I want to go from 9 to 3. Now visually, human beings are gifted because we have very good eyesight. All right, we can see things very well, unlike birds and bees and so on, which can't see things that well. All right, they can't see it that well as we can. We can see this graph, we can see the nodes, we can perceive what's going on here, and visually we can see that yes, 9841 is the answer. 13 98413 is the answer. I can tell you by just looking, but unfortunately a computer can't look at this graph and do the same thing that we are doing as human beings. All it knows is it's got nodes and it's got neighbors of nodes, isn't it? That's all it's got, and the neighbors are represented using adjacency matrix, adjacency list. That's all it's got. With that, it has to somehow find out how to go from 9 to 3. It has to find out how to do. Okay, so we can visualize, but the algorithm only knows nodes and neighbors of nodes. So it has to do something with the nodes and neighbors. So systematically it has to do something with the nodes and neighbors. So how do we systematically explore a graph? By using only the information about neighbors, which is stored either as adjacency matrix or adjacency list. This is the question they are asking, and that method of systematically exploring the graph can be done in many ways. One way is breadth first search, another way is depth first search. So breadth first search is a way of exploring the graph systematically, such that first we start with the vertex that is given to us, the start vertex. In this case, Chennai 9 is where we are starting. Then we visit the vertices that are one step away. One step away means one edge away. They are connected by one edge to this given vertex. Then we take those nodes which are 2 edges away, then the nodes which are 3 edges away, and so on. That's how we explore the graph. This method of exploring the graph by looking at how far away in terms of number of edges it is from the starting vertex is called breadth first search. Okay. So if I start with Chennai, for example, which is 9, I look at those nodes which are one step away, one edge away. So I see that 6, 8 and 10 are one edge away from 9. So I write 6, 8 and 10 in what is called level 1. This is level 0. Chennai is at level 0. This is at level 1, 6, 8 and 10. Level 1 means one edge away. Okay. Then I ask myself, which are the nodes which are 2 edges away. Now how do I find that out? 2 edges away means what? 2 edges away basically means they are one edge away from those nodes which are one edge away from the starting node 9. So which are the nodes which are one edge away from the starting node 9? 6, 8 and 10. So those nodes that are one edge away from 6, 8, 10 will be two edges away. Is that right? Absolutely right? Clearly not, because while doing that you might actually rediscover a node which you already discovered. Let's take 6. So when I am looking at 6 and I am looking at neighbors of 6, I find 8, 9 and 7 as neighbors. 8, 9 and 7 as neighbors of 6. I removed 6 and replaced it by 8, 9 and 7. But 9 is the node I started with. 9 is already at level 0. So putting 9 in level 2 doesn't make sense, right? Because 9 is already in level 0. So I should remove 9 because it's already there in level 0. And I should remove, so 7 and 8 are okay, right? 8, 9 and 7. 8 is already there in level 1. So I should remove 8. Only 7 is okay. Alright. So nodes which are visited already, which means they have already been marked as being in some level, should be taken away when I do this process. So how do I do that? A simple way of doing that is by keeping track of nodes I have seen already by using a tag called visited. How do I keep a tag? The easiest way of keeping a tag is to use an array. Okay, easiest way of tagging a node is using array. So I use, remember that nodes are all numbered, so I can number from 1 to n. So I can use an array which is of size n called visited, and I set visited I equal to true if I have seen that node before. If I have not seen that node before, then visited I will be set as false. Okay, so this way I can keep track of things that I have already seen. So that way then what happens now is 9 is there, 6, 8, 10. So when I come to level 2, I don't come back to nodes that I have seen already. So 7, 5, 4. So what is at level 3? So to find nodes at level 3, I need only look at nodes at level 2. Okay, why is that? Because in some sense, the nodes which are earlier nodes, that first search would have ensured I have exhausted them already. By the time I get to, so when I have come to level 2, I have exhausted all the neighbors of 6, 8, 10 already. So I don't need to look at neighbors of 6, 8, 10 anymore. I need only look at neighbors of 7, 5, 4. Okay. So the way breadth first search works, which is by exhausting one level before going to the next level, I can ensure basically therefore that I can go only to the level 2 nodes and examine the neighbors of that. Okay. So that's how I can find the level 3 nodes. Very easy to find the level 3 nodes. Okay. So how do I find the level 3 nodes now? I take the neighbors of 7, 5, 4. So 7, 5 and 4 the neighbors. So if I take 7 neighbors 6 and 5, 6 is visited already, 5 is visited already, so I can ignore it. Take the neighbors of 5, 4, 6 and 7, right. So 4, 6 and 7 are all visited, so I can drop that also, all of them are visited already. So if I come to 4, 4 has neighbors which is 8 and 5 and 1, 8 and 5 visited already, only 1 is unvisited, therefore level 3 has only one node which is 1. Is that clear? So how do I find then? How do I find the levels? I basically look at the previous level, look at all the neighbors of the nodes in that previous level, remove those nodes that have already been seen already, and then I'll get the next level. Okay, like that. So level 1, and I can go on. So for doing breadth first search, what do I need? I need to keep track of all the nodes which have been visited using a tag which is called visited I, which will be true when I is visited, will be false when it's not visited, and I keep track of all the things that I still need to do. Okay, I keep a queue for this, and the queue basically keeps track of all the things, nodes that I still have to work on. Okay, so let's see how this queue develops, right? I have seen already how visited is used. Let me see how this queue is developed. So let's say I start with 9. So first I add 9 to the queue. So the queue initially consists of 9. What I do is I remove 9 from the queue, right? So I remove 9 from the queue, and I take the neighbors of 9. What are the neighbors of 9? 6, 8 and 10. I add 6, 8 and 10 to the queue. Then from this queue, I take out the head of the queue, which is 6. Okay, I take out the head of 6, so I remove 6, and then I add to this the neighbors of 6. What are the neighbors of 6? The neighbors of 6 are 8, 7 and 5, right? So 8, 7 and 5. I did not write 8 because 8, I should have written 8 actually, because at this point 8 is not visited. So I should have written 7, 5 and 8 over here, okay. So that's what it should be, 8, 10, 10 because I got 10, when I visited 9 I got 10, and then I got 7, 5 and 8, I should have added 8 here, okay. And then I visit 8, so when I visit 8, so I take out 8 and then I take the neighbors of 8. What are the neighbors of 8? I get 4, I get 6 and 9. I don't need to add 9 because 9 is visited already. I don't need to add 6 because 6 is visited already, but I need to add 4. So I get 4 also gets added to this. There should be an 8 here number which I forgot. So put a 4, okay. Then I take out 10 because that's at the head of the queue. There is no neighbor of 10 that is not visited. 9 is visited already. No neighbor is not visited, so nothing happens. Then I go to the next head of the list, which is 7. I remove 7 and look at its neighbors, 7, 5 and 6. Okay, 5 is not visited, so I should add 5 to the end of the list. And 6 is visited, so 8 and 5 should actually have been added there. Okay, and go on like this. So this is how the thing goes on. Alright. So each time what you do basically is you take out the head of the queue, right, and then look at its neighbors. Those neighbors which have been visited already, you don't do anything with it. Those neighbors which are not visited, you add to the tail of the queue, add it to the end of the queue. And this is how you build the queue. So you can see basically that the BFS traversal function works like this. To start a BFS starting from node I, what do? I initially set the visited value for all the nodes as 0 and I start with an empty queue, and then what do? I take the node which is given to me, which is I say I is visited, like 9 in the case of earlier case, Chennai was you set it as visited, and I put I in the queue. This is how I get started with the program. Okay. Once I put I in the queue is non-empty, so I can get started. So as long as the queue is not empty, so in the beginning the queue is not empty because the start node is in it. Extract the head of the queue, and for each neighbor of the head of the queue that is not visited, so what is visited? J k equal to 0 says for each neighbor of the head of the queue that is not visited, visit that node and put that neighbor in the queue. Okay, put that neighbor in the queue. So this is what we are saying. Alright. So maybe actually that previous whatever queue thing I wrote, if this is the algorithm for visitation, that may be correct actually, but you have to check. Alright, check for yourself that it's correct. So when do we stop this breadth first search? Basically stop this breadth first search when the queue is empty. So you started with the queue not being empty because you added the start node in it. So when the queue is exhausted, which means all the nodes are visited, at this time you stop the breadth first search. So I have showed you how to systematically search a graph by using only neighbors, by using an additional data structure called visited, which is an array which sets all the nodes to visited when you see them, and another data structure which is called queue, which is a queue, of all the nodes that have been nodes that have yet to be explored. Okay. So what is the complexity of BFS, of this breadth first search? So you can see basically that each node, each vertex enters the queue exactly once. Why does it enter the queue exactly once? Because I am only entering in the queue nodes that have not been visited. You see, and just before putting a node, this should be append q k. All right, this should be append q k because you are putting k in the queue. All right. So what you are doing basically is, before putting a node in the queue, you are checking whether or not the node is visited, and if it is not visited, you first visit it, then you put it in the queue. So this makes sure basically that every node goes into the queue only once. Is that clear? You will never put a node in the queue twice. This is what it makes sure. So because every node is put in the queue exactly once, so every node is examined only once. Therefore there is some order n kind of operation that is going on, because every node is visited only once. But at each time you visit a node, you have to process all the neighbors of that node. Why do you have to process all the neighbors of the node? Because you have to take all the neighbors of the node and check whether they are visited. If they are not visited, you will put the neighbor in the queue. So you have to check whether or not the neighbor, for every neighbor you have to do something. If you have an adjacency matrix, then you know basically to look at all the neighbors takes order n time. Therefore, for every node that you visit, you will do order n operations. Therefore, you are doing n operations to visit all the nodes, and for every node you are doing n operations. Therefore, if you are using adjacency matrix, you will do order n square steps. So the breadth first search complexity with adjacency matrix is order n square. Is that okay? On the other hand, if you are using adjacency lists, then hopefully this is better because you don't have to do for every neighbor, you don't have to do a lot of work, right? Because the list maintains the list of neighbors, but it becomes much harder to count when you are doing adjacency list. Now see how this is very intricate, okay? When you do algorithms, especially when you do graph algorithms, counting, you have to know how to count. For doing complexity, you have to count, and you have to know how to count. Counting is the hard problem, okay? So you know that you have to visit all the nodes, and you know that at every node visit, you will process all the neighbors of this node. But how many neighbors? We don't know. It could be 3 neighbors, it could be 5 neighbors, it could be order n neighbors also. We don't know, okay? So worst case it might be order n. So then in that case, whether adjacency list or adjacency matrix, you will still do order n square. But there is a better way of counting. Now note that the breadth first search algorithm will visit every edge exactly 2 times. Okay, note that. It will visit every edge exactly 2 times. When will it visit an edge? It will visit an edge when it enters the edge from the source. So let's say UV is an edge. When you come and visit U, you look at the edge because you will look for the neighbors of U. So you look at the edge UV, alright, so to go to V. And again you will visit the edge UV when you come to V. When you visit V, you will come back and look at VU, the edge VU, okay, you look at the edge again. At this time when you look at this edge VU, you will find that U is visited. So you want to add U back to the queue. So every edge basically is visited 2 times, once when you go from U to V and once when you go from V to U. Of course, when you go from U to V, U is visited, V is not visited, so you will add V to the queue. When you go from V to U, V is visited, U is also visited, so therefore you are not going to add VU to the queue, you are not going to add U to the queue, okay. So you are going to visit every edge exactly 2 times. Because you are going to visit every edge in the algorithm exactly 2 times, therefore the complexity of the algorithm in terms of edges is order m, okay. So you are going to visit every node once, so order n, and you are going to visit every edge once, so you get order m, okay. So therefore the algorithm breadth first search has complexity order m plus n. Is this clear? Okay, is it clear? The complexity is order m plus n because order n is the complexity of visiting all the nodes, order m is the complexity of visiting all the edges, okay. So I want to now talk about how to use breadth first search to solve problems, alright. How do you use breadth first search to solve problems? So first problem that we are going to ask is, okay, I did a breadth first search, I did a traversal of the graph, but the question we are asking is, did it return the path to me? I wanted to find the path from 9 to 3, okay. All I have done so far is I have visited all the nodes of the graph carefully, systematically, in ensuring basically that I don't visit the same node more than once and so on. I visited, and using a breadth first search, I know the complexity of the algorithm using adjacency list is order m plus n. So I have found a way of visiting all the nodes and edges of the graph in a complexity order m plus n, but I still haven't found the path. How do I find the path? Okay. So question is, how do I find the path? The answer is, I can find, so this is the path. I can find the path if I remember how I came to a specific node in breadth first search, okay. So while visiting a vertex, if I remember where I came from, so when I came to 8, where did I come to 8 from? I came from 9. So when I was exploring 9, that is when I came to 8. 8 was a neighbor of 9. So if I remember that I came from 9, then I can trace back to 9 from 8. Alright, so how do I remember that I came from 9? I keep another way data structure called parent. Parent is a array which maintains for every vertex the parent, means where you came from. So parent of 8 I keep as 9, right, so that I know that when I come to 8, I know where I came from by using parent. Similarly, how did I come to 4? When I was exploring 8, I found 4 is a neighbor, so that's how I came to 4. So I maintain parent of 4 is 8. And how did I come to 1? I have 4, 1 was level 3, 4 was level 2. So from 4 I came to 1. So parent of 1 I keep as 4. Parent of 3 I keep as 1. So if I keep this kind of parent data structure, then it's easy for me when I reach 3, because I know I have to reach 3, right? 3 is the target for me. So when I reach 3, how do I trace the path back? I just look at the parent of 3, that gives me 1. I look at the parent of 1, that gives me 4. I look at the parent of 4, that gives me 8. I look at the parent of 8, that gives me 9. So just I can print through parent by just tracing the parent. I can print out 3, 1, 4, 8, 9, which is the path in reverse direction, of course, but it's printing the path. Once I print this path, then I can look in this direction, that gives me the path in the forward direction. Okay. So I can first application of breadth first search is to find the path, and you can easily check for yourself that the path that breadth first search will find is the path with the shortest number of edges, because it's every time it's picking the neighbors which are one level away. So it's finding the shortest number of edges away from 9 to 3, right? And so I can find the path from 3 to 9. This is the first simple application of breadth first search. Okay. So I have written it in algorithmic form. What I did is I added one more data structure called parent. Whenever I visited a node, I set that visited node to 1 and I set the parent of that node to j. Okay, that's what I've done. Question, all right, for you. Question for you. Can I use breadth first search to find out if a graph is connected? When do I say a graph is connected? I say a graph is connected if every pair of nodes in the graph, I can find a path from u to v. If u is a node and v is the node in the graph, there is a path from u to v, then the graph is said to be connected. Okay. So the graph we have been seeing up to now is a connected graph. So question for you, can we use BFS, breadth first search, to check if a graph is connected? If so, how do we do it? How do we do it? How do you use breadth first search to check if a graph is connected? Okay, anybody wants to take this question? How do I check whether a graph is connected using breadth first search? Is there a simple way of doing it with breadth first search? If there is a path from u to v, breadth first search will find this path, that we know. Alright, we know that if there is a path from u to v, breadth first search will find this path. So if the graph is connected, then you will find basically a path from every node to, you can find a path from the source node to every other node. That's what you will find. But what if the graph is not connected? What happens then? How do I use BFS to check whether the graph is? So I want to write an algorithm which will take a given graph represented using, say, adjacency list, and it will return me true if the graph is connected. It will return me false if the graph is disconnected. How do I use breadth first search for doing this? Anybody wants to take that? Okay, so I have something on the chat. All visited will be set if connected. Very good. So that is correct. When you start with a given node, if you find that all nodes get visited at the end of the breadth first search, you know the graph is connected. So if after you start with any given node, you do the breadth first search, at the end of the breadth first search, when you finish with the breadth first search, between the queue is empty, so the breadth first search returns, you take your visited array and check whether all the visited is set or not. If visited is set for all the nodes, it basically means the graph is connected. If visited is set, not set, which means it's false or 0 for some of the nodes, it means your graph is disconnected. Okay, so very good GC. I think this is a good answer. So that's a very simple way of doing it. To check whether graph is connected or not, all you have to do is run BFS from any node and look at the end of it. You look at the visited array and check whether or not all the nodes over there are set to 1 or any of the nodes are set to 0. You know whether the graph is connected or not. Okay. All right. So of course, if you want to print out all the connected components of the graph, that is a little bit more complicated. Okay. If I want to find all the connected components of a graph, we may have to do more work. We'll discuss in tomorrow's class. It's one of the problems in directed graphs that I am going to post for the class tomorrow. Okay, but for the moment I am only asking you to check whether the graph is connected. So we can do that very simply by using BFS. Okay, so what kind of structure does BFS expose of the graph? What kind of structure did we find when we did BFS of the graph? Now I have drawn the structure of the graph, this graph, after doing BFS. So we found that 9 is at level 0, we found 6, 8, 10 were at a level 1, 7, 5, 4 were at level 2, 1 was at level 3, 2, 3 were at level 4. And in fact when I went from 9 to 6, 8 and 10, I found I visited 6 and 8 and 10 for the first time. So there are solid edges drawn in this graph, this visitation. I'm drawing this kind of structure, right, this structure graph. So I'm drawing solid edges in this structure graph when I visit the node for the first time. From 6, when I go to 7, 5, again 7 and 5 I visit for the first time, so I saw solid edges. But when I see 8 from 6, I find that I enter 6, I find that it has a neighbor which is 8, but 8 is visited already. 8 is visited already. So what happened basically is, instead of drawing this as an edge which is solid edge, normally I don't draw it as solid edge in the graph, I draw a dotted edge. Okay, so I am classifying the edges in the graph as either solid edges or dotted edges. How am I classifying this as solid or dotted? It is a solid edge if it is going from a node to the next node for the first time, which means that I am visiting 6 for the first time, therefore 9 to 6 is a solid edge. Whereas 6 to 8, 6 is visited, 8 is also visited, so therefore we have a dotted edge. Is that clear? So whenever I am drawing an edge between two visited nodes, I put dotted edge. When I am drawing an edge between a visited and an unvisited node, I put solid edge. And you can easily see for yourself that the solid edge graph with just the solid edges forms a tree, which is called the BFS tree of the graph. And when you add these dotted edges, you get, of course you get cycles, right? You get a graph which has more, it's more than a tree, plus tree plus additional edges. So you have dotted edges. Now can we say anything about these dashed or dotted edges of this graph? Okay, can we say anything? This is the question I am asking, right? Can we say anything about these dashed lines? Now note, one thing we can say is that the dashed line can of course be within one level, right? Like between 6, 8 and 7 is in one level, and I have a dashed line between 6 and 8. So I can have a dashed line inside one level. Can I have dashed line across levels? Can I have a dashed line between 6 and 4? Can I have a dashed line between 9 and 1? Can I have a dashed line between 9 and 2? And so on. This question we are asking. And it is very easy to observe that the dashed lines cannot occur between nodes that are 2 levels away. Okay. For example, I cannot have a dashed line between 6 and 2. I cannot have, because that's 3 levels away. I cannot have a dashed line between 10 and 1. Why can't I have dashed line between 10 and 1? Assume for a moment that I have a dashed line between 10 and 1. Okay. What does it mean? It means that when I came to 10, 10 had a neighbor. This is a line, right? This means there is an edge. 10 had a neighbor 1. So if 10 had a neighbor 1, then what should I have done? I should have visited 1. So why is this 1 at level 3? It should have been at level 2. So if there were an edge between 10 and 1, 1 would be at level 3. Level 2 would not be at level 3. Okay. So it's not possible that I visited this edge from 10. So is it possible that I visited this edge from 1? Then what happened is I came from 9 to 8 to 4 to 1, and then I found an edge from 1 to 10. But if there was an edge between 1 and 10, then I should have discovered this edge when I came to 10 like this. I should have discovered this edge. So there is no way that 1 will be at a level 3, right, if there is an edge between 10 and 1. It should be at level 2 or maybe even at level 1. So two nodes that are connected by an edge in the graph will be separated either by 0 levels, which means they will be at the same level, or they will be separated by 1 level. Okay, they will be at neighboring levels. There is no way in breadth first search that you can have two nodes that are connected by an edge that are at levels two positions away. Is that okay? So once we recognize this, we see basically that all the dashed edges or dotted edges are basically going to be either inside a level or they are going to be between neighboring levels. Why is that interesting? Okay, why is that interesting? That is interesting basically because we can use the dashed edges to detect what are called odd cycles or even cycles, right? So you can see basically that every dashed edge contributes to a cycle. For example, here the dashed edge between 6 and 8 contributes to a cycle 968. The dashed edge 7 5 contributes to the cycle 675. The dashed edge 7 5 and 5 4 together contribute to the cycle 9 6 7 5 4 8 9. I can make cycle like this. So whenever I have dashed edges, it makes cycle. When I have multiple dashed edges, it makes bigger cycle. Okay, so I can make out of dashed edges, I can make cycles, and I can easily see basically that edges, whenever I am having a cycle with a single dashed edge, that cycle will always be an odd cycle. Is that easy to see? When I have only one dashed edge in the cycle, that cycle will be an odd cycle, because it will be an odd cycle. I mean, it will be an odd cycle if it's in the same level, right? So I have 5 and 4 have a dashed edge in the same level, right? So 9 6 5, the distance between 9 and 5 through 6, the distance between 9 and 4 through 8 will be the same, because 5 and 4 are at the same level, and therefore when I add this one edge 5 4 to it, this is equal to this, and add 5 4 to it, I get an odd number, right? So this is 2, this is also 2, 2 plus 2 4 plus 1, so therefore 5. So this is a 5 edge cycle, so it's an odd cycle. So whenever I have a dashed edge in the same level and I make a cycle out of it which contains only one dashed edge, that cycle will always be an odd cycle. Similarly, consider for example 6 8. If I take this dashed edge 6 8, it makes an odd cycle 9 6 8, right? 7 5 makes an odd cycle 6 7 5. On the other hand, if I take two dashed edges 7 5 and 5 4, it will not make an odd cycle. 9 6 7 5 4 8 9 is a cycle which is 6 edge cycle. Okay, so I can detect odd cycles. How do I detect odd cycles? I detect odd cycles by looking at dashed edges inside the same level and making a cycle which contains that dashed edge, only that dashed edge. Okay, that will be an odd cycle. A graph will have odd cycles if and only if you have dashed edges at the same level. Okay, why is that interesting? Because that helps me to find out a property of a graph which is called bipartite. Right? Bipartite graph is a kind of graph that is very interesting because a lot of real life problems can be modeled using bipartite graphs. What are bipartite graphs? I separate the nodes of the graph into two subsets, V1 and V2, such that all the edges in the graph either lie between V1 or go between V1 to V2 or V2 to V1. It's undirected, obviously I only need to say that V1 to V2, right? There are no edges inside V1 and there are no edges inside V2, right? There are no edges completely inside V1, there are no edges completely inside V2. So you can see this example graph which I have drawn here. There are no edges inside V1, there are no edges inside V2, all the edges are drawn between V1 and V2. Such a graph is called a bipartite graph. Why is a bipartite graph interesting? Bipartite graph is interesting because many times in real life we try to provide matching between two things. Like students want to register for courses, alright, students want to register for electives. So every student opts for some electives, but not every elective can be given to every student, because electives you want to limit the number of students that are there in the elective. So therefore you select some number of students for every elective. So what happens basically is that student ends up getting some elective which he wants, but he doesn't get probably the best choice. So if I want to have students on one side, V1 is the set of students, V2 is the set of electives, and I am trying to match students to electives, this problem turns out to be what is called a matching problem on bipartite graphs. Students are the nodes V1, edges, the electives are the nodes V2, and we are drawing an edge between a student and an elective. The student likes that elective, then we draw an edge, right? And then so we get a bipartite graph. You are not drawing edges between two students, we are not drawing edges between two electives, because it doesn't make sense. Similarly, if you are trying to create a graph where you are pairing employees and employers, employees want to get jobs, there are jobs available, employers have come forward for placement, so they are jobs, giving jobs. So on one side you have employees, on the other side you have employers or people who are coming for placement. Every student says I prefer to do the work for this company, so you have an edge between an employee and employer depending on the preference of the employee, which employer they want to work for. and every employer also has to say basically that he likes the student, so you will have some edges like that. So you get a graph which is connecting the employees and employers, and you have to select for every employee and employer. Every employee can only go to one company. For every employee you have to select the employer, and for every employer you have to select, you can select more than one employee, okay, in some sense. But if you are creating a matching, you might write on the right side, instead of writing V2 as employers, you might write V2 as job positions. So each job position can be filled only by one person, which means basically you are trying to find a matching, which means for every employer you are associating a job, and for every job position you are associating an employee. Okay, so lot of applications that you can find for these bipartite graphs. So I am asking a very simple question: if I give you a graph, can you check whether the graph is bipartite? I give you a graph, can you check whether the graph is bipartite? For example, this graph is not bipartite. Okay, this graph is not bipartite. I cannot separate this graph into two sets of vertices V1 and V2, because that all the edges are contained only between V1 and V2. There are no edges inside V1, there are no edges inside V2. It's not possible to do it. Okay, now I'll show you shortly why it's not possible to do it, because if you look at this bipartite graph I showed you, this diagram, you will observe a very property immediately of this, right, that this graph has no odd cycle. If this graph has to have a cycle starts from a node and ends up in the node, right? So you have to start with V1, I'll go somewhere, I'll go somewhere, I'll go somewhere, and I'll come back here. I'll go like this, go like this, go like this, come back here. So each time I go from here to here and come back here, I'm counting two edges, one to go from here to here and one to come back. So two edges. I go here, come back, 4 edges. Go here, come back, 6 edges. Come back here, 8 edges. So every cycle that starts at a node and ends at a node has to have an even number of edges. Okay. So the bipartite graph cannot have odd cycles. But there is something that is more interesting, the reverse, converse, which is that if a graph does not have odd cycles, then that graph is bipartite. You can prove it, okay. I am not going to prove it here, but it's easy to prove it. In fact, when I show you the method of constructing the bipartite graph, you will see immediately that it's true. That if a graph has no odd cycles, then that graph will be bipartite, which means it's an if and only if. The graph is bipartite if and only if it is no odd cycles. So we know that breadth first search of a graph can detect whether a graph has odd cycles or not. Okay. So I can check therefore whether the graph is bipartite or not. Why do I want to check whether the graph is bipartite or not? Because I want to see whether I can apply matching type algorithms on this graph. So that is useful only if the graph is bipartite. So checking whether the graph is bipartite may be useful in some situations. Alright. So how do I check whether the graph is bipartite? I check whether the graph has odd cycles. How do I check whether the graph has odd cycles? I know that the graph has odd cycles if BFS will find dotted edges inside the same level, then basically it has odd cycles. So whenever BFS does not find dotted edges inside the same level, it has no odd cycles. Okay. So if for example I did a BFS, this graph is not bipartite because it has odd cycles. It has odd cycles because it found many dotted edges inside the same level. Okay. So if it found none of those dotted edges, basically then the graph is. So for example, from the given graph, if I remove these edges, these 4 edges which are inside the same level, remove it, then that graph became, of course it became a tree. In this case it became a tree. The graph is bipartite. Okay, because it has no odd cycles. Now question I can ask myself is, if the graph is known to be bipartite because it has no odd cycles, can I construct a bipartite graph from it? The answer is, which means I have to construct the partitions V1 and V2. Answer is I can very easily do it. How do I do it? Take all the odd numbered levels and put them in one partition. Take all the even numbered levels and put them in another partition. So 9, 7, 5, 4, 2, 3 should be in one partition, and 6, 8, 10 and 1 should be in the other partition, right? Because then I know basically that all the edges are running only from, there are no edges inside one level, because we know that all the edges inside one level are going to give rise to odd cycles, and so that they are removed. They are saying that such edges in when a graph is bipartite, there will be no such edges. Therefore, there are only edges going between levels, and therefore I can take odd levels and put it in one partition, one side of the partition, take the even levels and put it in the other side of the partition. So this is what I have done here. I have taken 6, 8, 10 and 1 and put it on this side, and taken 9, 7, 5, 4, 2, 3 and put it on that side, and you can very easily see this graph is bipartite. All the edges are running only between this side and that side. Okay. So a very simple way of checking a graph is bipartite is by running breadth first search on it. So I have given you one application. There are obviously there are many more applications of breadth first search you will discover yourself when you do algorithms, but we can't discuss too many of them. I have given you one. I want to move to the next method of traversal with that, which is called depth first search. Okay, depth first search. Depth first search. How is depth first search different from breadth first search? In depth first search, what you do is you explore the graph not level by level as you did in BFS, but explore the graph depth first. What does it mean? You take a vertex, take a neighbor of that vertex, visit it, then instead of visiting all the neighbors of the first node, you take this neighbor which you found, take neighbor of that node, visit it, take a neighbor of that node, visit it, and go on. So you are going depth first, which means you are going in one direction. You are taking a node V, finding a neighbor U, visiting it, finding a neighbor of U, let us say W, visiting it, finding a neighbor of W, let us say X, visiting it, finding a neighbor of X, let us say Y, visiting it, and so on. How far you will go like this? You will go as far as you do not have any more neighbors which are unvisited. When you find that you have no more neighbors which are unvisited, then you come back. Where do you come back? You come back to a node, previous node. Then you check again whether there are any more neighbors unvisited. If not, you go back. So you are backtracking. Alright, you are backtracking. So that is how this works. So start with 9. Let us say we visit 6 first. Then you pick a neighbor of 6. Let us say we pick 7. Then you pick a neighbor of 7. So 6 is visited already, so only 5 is there, so you pick 5. Then you pick a neighbor of 5, 6 and 7 are visited, only 4 is there, so you pick 4. Then you pick a neighbor of 4, so you pick 8. 8 is a neighbor of 4, so you can pick 8, you come to 8. Then 8's neighbors are 9, 6 and 4, all are visited. 8's neighbors are 4, 6 and 9, all are visited. So now I have to go back. Where do I go back? I have to go back where I came to 8 from. Where do I came back? I came from 4. So go back to 4 and see what else I can do at 4. So clearly this is not as easy as breadth first search. I have to keep track of where I came from for every node and go back there. What data structure do I need to keep track of things and go back to where I came from? Now I know that a queue is a good data structure to keep track of things to do. What are the list of things to do? Keep track. Add things to the end of the queue and follow in the order in which the things came in, I keep processing it. But here what I am using, what data structure I am using, what I am following here is a stack, right? I am taking a node, visiting it, taking its neighbor, visiting it, taking a neighbor, visiting it and so on. Only when I can't visit any neighbor, then I backtrack to the node. And how do I backtrack? So what I need basically to do backtracking is I need a stack. Backtracking is like popping a stack. So I push a node into a stack and go visit its neighbor. If I can't find any neighbor, then I go back, which means I pop the stack and go back. Okay. So going back is like popping the stack. So we need a stack for this, similar to returning from subroutines, right? Very similar to returning subroutines, which is why depth first search is coded using recursion. You don't have to write DFS using recursion. You can write DFS without using recursion by using a stack data structure. But most algorithmic representations of DFS will use recursion because normal subroutine calls already builds a stack, so might as well use it. Okay, so it's coded using recursion. You'll find most of DFS written using recursion. How the stack develops? You start with 9. You visited a neighbor 6, but you keep track of 8 and 10. So keep 8 and 10. Go to 6. Go to 7. Go to 5. Right? Go to 4. Go to 8. When you go to 8, you have to pop the stack. So you go back to 4. From 4 you will have to find a neighbor. So from 4 find the next neighbor and so on. That's how you do it. Okay, so marking the node as visited I have shown here by showed by marking it as underlined. Okay, that's how you do it. So the algorithm for DFS, basically what does it do? It starts just like in BFS, you start with marking all the nodes as not visited, unvisited. So you mark visited j is equal to 0 for all the nodes, and remember we want to come back to this node, we want to trace the path back to this node, so we kept a parent node link. So I keep parent of j equal to -1. It basically means that I don't know the parent of j as yet, right? First, of course, the source node. For the source node, the parent of j is going to be -1 forever because you're never going to have a parent for it. But in the beginning, you set all the parent of all the nodes to -1. It means that I don't know the parent. That's what it means. Okay. You mark the first node I as visited. So to do the mark of I as visited, what I'm doing is I'm calling the function DFS with the parameter I. I is the source node. I'm starting with I. I call DFS with I. What does DFS with I, calling DFS with I do? First thing it does is it marks I as visited. First thing it does is it marks I as visited. Okay. After marking I as visited, and why is it doing that? It's doing that because if you don't do that, you might end up in a loop. The program can go into a loop perpetually. You be careful. I'm marking I as visited so that if I go further down and if I come back to this node, program will find it's visited and come back. It will not go into a perpetual loop. Right? Recursion, you can end up going into a perpetual loop very easily. So first thing I'll do is I'll mark I as visited. After I marked I as visited, for each neighbor of I, j, right? If the neighbor is not visited already, then I first set the parent of j as I and I go call DFS j. So every node basically what it will do is it will mark its node as visited, it will pick a neighbor, if the neighbor is visited then it will skip that neighbor, the neighbor is not visited, it will enter that node with DFS. It's not marking the node as visited, remember. It enters that node as visited, it enters that node using DFS. So recursive call using DFS. When DFS enters with that node j as argument, first thing it will do is it will mark that node as visited, it will mark j as visited, and then it will check all the neighbors of j, and then it will find a neighbor which is not visited, and then it will call DFS with that argument, with that node as an argument. So DFS k it will call. So like that it will keep calling recursively, and when it will exit this recursive call, it will exit this recursive call when it cannot find any neighbors which have not been visited. When all the neighbors are visited, at that point in time, the DFS will terminate, right? DFS call will terminate, and what will it do? It will return. When it returns, what happens? It pops the stack. In some sense, it returns back to the previous call, and there it will look for the next neighbor. Okay, so that's what it does. So very easy to write this using recursion. Okay, so when does this program stop? The program stops when DFSI exits. That's when it stops. Remember, BFS stopped when the queue became empty. Here you should stop when the stack becomes empty. So the stack becomes empty when the program returns. That's when the stack returns, becomes empty. So DFSI is called, which calls j, which calls k, which calls l, and so on, and then they pop, and then out it comes. Then DFS exits. So very simple algorithm, right? In fact, actually, if you can't write the pseudo code for an algorithm in one page, if you can't see it in one page, your algorithm will surely have mistakes in it. Okay, you should strive to write your algorithm in abstractions using data structures and algorithm structures and so on in such a way that you can write the pseudo code in a single page if possible. It makes it very easy to understand, correct mistakes and so on. So here I have written DFS in one page, and we'll try, as possible, we'll try to write everything in one page. Okay. Now let's look at what the complexity of DFS is. Okay, we saw the complexity of DFS. The adjacency matrix was order n square, adjacency list was order m plus n. We're asking ourselves, what is the complexity of DFS? Now clearly DFS visits all the nodes exactly once. Why? Because as soon as it enters the node, it marks it visited. Right? DFS, first thing it does, it marks the node visited. Every node is visited only once. Is that okay? So we know there is an order n sitting there. If you're using adjacency matrix, then when we visit the node, we will look at all the neighbors of the node, and that looking at all the neighbors of the node in adjacency matrix takes order n time. So therefore, overall for adjacency matrix, complexity is order n square. Okay. We can ask the question, what if we use adjacency list instead of adjacency matrix? The answer is same as BFS. Same as BFS. What is the same as BFS? Counting is very hard to do if you do with nodes and edges. But we have to note basically that every edge we visit exactly twice. When do we visit the edge? We will visit the edge when we come to U, and then we go from U to V. V is not visited. So we go from U to V, mark V as visited. That time we look at UV. Second time we look at UV is when we come to V, and then we come back looking at VU. That time we see that U is already visited, so we return. But every edge basically is looked at twice, once from the side of U and once from the side of V, and no more than twice. So we know basically that every edge is visited exactly twice. So visiting all the edges takes order m time, and therefore we are visiting all the nodes exactly once, and visiting all the edges exactly twice, and therefore the complexity of this algorithm is order m plus n. Okay, you got to learn how to count like this. All right, this kind of counting methods you have to learn. You have to keep at your fingertips, because this is how you do complexity in algorithms, especially in graph algorithms. Okay, so order m plus n is the complexity of DFS. So knowing that the complexity of DFS is order m plus n, and there are ways to improve this complexity of BFS and DFS, but I am not looking at it right now. But right, so if knowing that it's order m plus n, asking the question, how do we use DFS? Can we really use DFS anywhere? And first thing I will see is, can I use DFS to produce the path, okay, from 3 to 9. So note that, how did we visit 3? We went from 9 to 6, from 6 we went to 7, from 7 we went to 5, 5 we went to 4, from 4 we went to 8, went back to 4, 4 we went to 1, 1 we went to 2, 2 we went to 3. This is how we went to 3, okay. But if you look at the parent data structure, 3's parent will be set as 2, 2's parent will be set as 1, 1's parent will be set as 4, 4's parent will not be set as 8, 4's parent will be set as 5. Why? 4's parent will be set as 5 because 4, we reached 4 first time from 5. The parent node is set only when we reach 4 for the first time. We came to 8, from 8 we came back to 4, that is by backtracking, okay. So we are setting the parent node only when we come from 5 to 4 for the first time. That's why 4's parent is set to 5. So when you look at parent, you will go from 3 to 2 to 1 to 4 to 5 to 7 to 6 to 9. So that's how you look, and then you can write, you can print this out in reverse, and you got the path. Now this is not the shortest path from 9 to 3. So very clearly, very obviously, DFS will not return the shortest path. Okay, it can find some very long winded path from 9 to 3. So if it is not finding the shortest path in terms of number of edges, what is it doing, DFS, and why do we need it? In fact, I have had many times students asking me, why do we need DFS at all? I have BFS, it does great job of finding the shortest path. DFS is just doing some stupid thing, it's using recursion. Why do I need it? Why do I need it at all? What is it doing? It's not doing anything for me, right? It's a waste of time doing DFS. Okay, so if it's not finding the shortest path, why am I doing DFS? The answer is, DFS finds structure of the graph, much better structure of the graph it discovers than BFS. BFS also discovered some structure, right? We noticed basically that BFS discovered odd cycles, for example. But DFS discovers many more interesting properties of the graph for me, which is why DFS is interesting. What kind of properties of the graph does DFS find? The question I am asking. So let us just look at this example and see what kind of structure it discovered. So I started with 9, I went to 6, 7, 5, 4, 8, went back to 4, went to 1, 2, 3, from 3 I went to 1, right, from 3 I went to 1, but I found that 1 was visited already. So what I did is, whenever I went from a node to a node I have visited already, that edge I mark as a dotted or dashed edge, similar to BFS. Edges that I get when I visit a node for the first time are shown by dark lines. Those edges that I get when I go from a visited node to another visited node, I show by a dashed line. So I can see basically that the solid lines here make a tree. So 9 to 10, 9 to 6, 7, 5, 4, 8, 4 to 1, 2, 3 forms a tree. This tree is called the DFS tree. We found a BFS tree. This tree is called the DFS tree. Okay. Tomorrow I will show you a problem. We will actually look at a problem and you will try to solve the problem yourself. And the question I am asking you is, what kind of situations will the BFS tree will be the same as the DFS tree? The trees are the same. What kind of situations? Think about it. Okay. Tomorrow's class we will look at this as a problem, but as a homework, think about it. When will the BFS tree and the DFS tree be exactly the same? Think about it. Meanwhile, here what we have found is, we have found a DFS tree and we found these edges, dotted edges, which basically connect visited nodes to each other. And you see basically one of the interesting properties that we see in the DFS is this dotted edge will always go back to an ancestor. Why is that? Because only the ancestor is visited. From 9 I visit 6, I went to 7, visited 5, visited 4, visited 8, visited, right. Then I found a dotted edge. It has to point back to an ancestor of 9, 8, because that is a visited. Okay. If in fact it was going to 1, then 1 has not been visited. So it should have continued 8 to 1 to 2 to 3, it would have continued like that. So if it is a dotted edge back, it means it is going back to an ancestor of the node. What is an ancestor? Ancestor means if I trace a path back in the tree, I will go to 6, 8 to 4 to 5 to 7 to 6. To the parent links, I can trace a path back to 6. So that is an ancestor. Okay. So I find basically that dashed lines, the DFS discovers dashed lines, but these dashed lines are always pointing back to ancestors. Okay, that is nice. Now, you notice anything else in this diagram? I notice basically that there is a solid lines which is making a tree. I notice that there are dashed lines which are pointing backward in the graph to the parents or ancestors. Is there anything else that I can see? Is there anything else that you can see here? Is the graph looking nice? I mean, is there some kind of structure that you are seeing in this graph, right? So if you stare at it for some time, you will see basically that DFS seems to divide this graph into clusters, isn't it? Can you see that? It seems to divide this graph at least into clusters. What are these clusters? I can see basically that it has divided 1, 2, 3 into one cluster, and it is divided 9, 6, 7, 5, 4, 8 into another cluster. Can you see that? 1, 2, 3 seems to form a cluster, and these nodes seem to form a cluster. What do I mean by cluster? A cluster is something where there seems to be more than one path between any two nodes. There are two ways to go between 2 and 3. I can go from 2 to 3, or I can go from 2 to 1 to 3. Two paths from 2 to 3. Similarly, in this cluster, there are two paths from 9 to 5, let us say. I can go from 9 to 8 to 4 to 5. I can go 9 to 6 to 7 to 5. So this cluster, okay, later on we'll, I mean, I am not giving a formal definition. Cluster is not a formal thing in a graph. Okay, we will see in tomorrow's class that there is something called, today's class, later on we'll see there is basically something called strongly connected component. That is a much better definition of what I am describing here as a cluster. But there seems to be some nice thing here. 1, 2, 3 and 9, 6, 7, 5, 4, 8, they seem to form clusters. Okay, clusters in the sense every pair of nodes is connected at least in two different ways, two different paths you can go. Okay, whereas if you look at 10, it seems sitting isolated, and I seem that I can separate out. So what does it mean, these clusters? It means that I can cut the graph into parts. I can break it down into its clusters. How do I cut the graph? I cut the graph by cutting the edges which connect these clusters to each other. So there is a thing called a cut edge in a graph. Okay, a cut edge in a graph is an edge which if you remove, the graph will get disconnected. Okay, if you have a graph, if there is an edge, if I remove that edge, the graph becomes disconnected, then that edge is called a cut edge, right? Now you can ask what happens if the graph is already disconnected. Then the answer is, if the graph is already disconnected, then you count how many connected components are there in the graph, and then you say an edge is a cut edge if it increases the number of connected components by 1. Okay, right now we have only one connected component in this graph. The whole graph is connected, therefore we are interested in seeing whether the edge will disconnect this graph. So there are two edges which can disconnect this graph. One is 4, 1. So you see that if I remove 4, 1, then the graph gets disconnected because 1, 2, 3 will fall off, right? This is like a stem of a plant. If I cut this thing at 4, 1, this 1, 2, 3 will fall off. Okay. Similarly, if I cut this edge here, 10 will fall off, isn't it? So there are two cut edges in this graph. 4, 1 is a cut edge, 9, 10 is a cut edge. And question we want to ask ourselves is, can we use somehow DFS to find cut edges? Okay, can we find these cut edges? Why are cut edges interesting? Okay, they are interesting in many applications. For example, imagine that you are creating a routing situation. You have created, I don't know if you face this problem, but many times we find that internet connection in our house or in our office or something goes away. Why? You talk to the provider and he says fiber is cut. Somebody dug the road for putting pipeline or putting some cable or something, and what they did is they cut the fiber. Does it happen? I mean, you face it, I face it all the time, my office I face it all the time. Fiber is cut. Okay. So question we are asking is, some fiber is cut, it's okay because it might affect only one person or an office or something like that. But imagine that the underwater cable running between Bombay and Dubai or something like that is cut, and that is the only cable connecting India to the rest of the world. All of India will be connected to the internet through that cable. If it gets cut, India will be not connected to the internet anymore. That's really, really bad, isn't it? So question we are asking is it possible that India gets disconnected from the internet if one of the fibers get cut? And the answer is that if there is a cut edge in the graph, fiber graph of the world, right, then that can happen, right? It can happen that there is a cut edge, then India can get disconnected. So we should make sure that basically there are no cut edges in such kinds of graphs which are made of fiber links, because if there is one cut edge, even if one of the nodes get cut, I can find an alternate way of going to the internet, right? Some other ways there of going to the internet. So I have redundant links which basically allow me to connect to the internet even if this is cut. Therefore, cut edges are interesting, right? Cut edges are interesting because they represent some kind of vulnerability. In fact, security problems, when you're looking at issues of security, you know, is there a single point of failure? If somebody does some denial of service attack, means somebody tries to attack a node in the network and tries to bring that node down, will the entire network go down because that node has gone down? Question we can ask. The answer is there are such nodes which are very important nodes, which if you bring down, all the nodes can go down, and such nodes are called cut vertices, right? Like cut edges, you cut vertices. If you cut that edge vertex from the graph, the entire graph gets disconnected. So then that node is vulnerable. Okay, so they are very interested in finding out vulnerabilities in a graph, and vulnerability is in some sense defined by cut vertices and cut edges. Okay, now how do you find a cluster? You notice basically that 67548 is not a cluster. Why is it not a cluster? It's not a cluster because there is an edge going out of this cluster to 9. Of course, there is an edge 9 to 6 which is also going out of the cluster, but generally I think it looks like if there is a dotted edge going out of the cluster, then that is not a cluster, right? If there is a bunch of nodes from which a dotted edge is going out, then that is not a cluster. It seems to be some kind of way to find a cluster, right? So my simple naive algorithm is, if I can find a bunch of nodes such that no dotted edge is going out of it, then that bunch of nodes must be a cluster. Does it make sense? That seems to be my first approach at making the algorithm, because I can see at least over here that there is a dotted edge going out and it is not a cluster. But if I had included 9 in this, then 9, 6, 7, 5, 4, 8 will have the property that there is no dotted edge going out of it. 1, 2, 3 has a property that if I take 1, 2, 3 together, no dotted edge is going out of it. So maybe a simple way of finding a cluster is simply to look at a bunch of nodes such that no dotted edge is going out of it. How do I know whether a dotted edge is going out of a cluster or not? Is there a simple way of finding that out? The answer is this is possible by using some simple counters. Okay, counters. So most DFS algorithms that you will find in your book, if you have read it in a book, you will find that they use these counters. Okay, why do you use these counters? The answer is you use these counters because they help you to solve problems, like for example finding out whether a dotted edge is going out of a cluster or not. Helps you find out. Okay, so what are these counters that they are keeping? They are keeping two counters. One is called pre, another is called post. Okay, so first thing I do is I keep a count of all the visits to a node. Okay, now not the number of times, I'm not counting the number of nodes visited. I'm counting the number of times a node has been visited. Node will be visited once when you enter the node and once when you exit the node. Okay, so each time you encounter a node, that is once when you enter it, once when you leave it, I count. So I keep, initially I start with count equal to 0, then I enter the node. See, DFS I set the node as visited, I entered the node, when I entered the node I increment the count. When I finish with the node and I am exiting from the node, at this time I increment the count. So 2 times I increment the count, once when I enter the node and once when I exit the node. Every node will contribute 2 to the count. So the total value of count when I finish with this algorithm will be equal to 2n. Is that clear? Because when I enter the node I will count once, when I leave the node I will count once, I will do like that for every node. So the total value of count when I finish with DFS is going to be 2n. So I keep track of this count value in pre-I and post-I. Pre-I keeps track of the count value when you enter and post-I when you leave. Okay, Like that I keep track of 2 counters. Now the first interesting property you notice about this pre and post is what is called the parenthesis structure. This is called the parenthesis theorem of DFS. Okay, parenthesis structure. What it says basically is that the pre-post interval, the pre value and the post value. Pre value for 9 is 0, post value I have not written yet. I don't know yet. We'll find out, right? What that is. But if I draw the interval, the line joining the pre value to the post value count, then this interval will enclose the interval, like parentheses is enclosed inside each other like that. It will enclose the interval of all its descendants. So 9's interval will enclose 6 interval, contain 6's interval, will contain 7's interval, 5's interval and 4's interval, and 4's interval has 2 nodes, 8 and 1, 2 descendants. So 4's interval will contain both 8's interval and 1's interval. Okay. So to draw that, so 4's interval will enclose 8's interval and will enclose 1's interval. 1's interval will enclose 2's interval, 2's interval will enclose 3's interval. So this structure which you notice of the pre-post values in terms of parenthesis, like as if it's parenthesis, right? This is like saying that x plus y close bracket plus or multiplied by u plus v close bracket, whole thing put inside bracket, whole thing put inside bracket. Okay. So parenthesis structure. So either 2 intervals are overlapping or disjoint. You can't have this interval of 8 overlapping interval of 1. It can't be like that. Okay. Either 8 is disjoint from 1 or 8 is contained in 1 or 1 is contained in 8. So this structure, beautiful structure, is called parenthesis structure. So you can see basically if I start with 4, so when I enter 4 the counter is 4. Why is that? When I entered 9 the counter is 0, here it is 1, here it is 2, here it is 3, here it was 4. So when I entered 4 the count is 4, when I entered 8 the count is 5, then nothing further to do with 8, so exit. So when I exit 8 the counter is 6, then I enter 1, when I enter 1 the counter is 7, when I do 2 it becomes 8, enter 3 it becomes 9, exit 3 it becomes 10, right. So the post values I am showing in red and I am showing the green, the entry values. So when I go into 2 it becomes 11, when I exit 1 it becomes 12, then I come to 4, I exit 4 it becomes 13, then I exit 5 it becomes 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 and then come out. Okay. So that is how the parenthesis structure looks. So you can see basically that the parenthesis structure for 9, interval for 9 will contain the interval for 6 and will contain the interval for 10. So the pre-post intervals are beautifully structured, very nicely structured. Okay, that's what I noticed first. And then I see also that that structure tells me something, right? It tells me something about the graph. In fact, by using the pre values, the post values, I can do something with the graph. I can say something about that. I'm going to keep one more counter called low, okay, just because I want to check, going back to this problem of finding clusters, right? I wanted to check whether or not there is a dotted edge that gets out of a cluster or not. So I'm going to keep another counter called low. What does low record? Low records the lowest pre value encountered while traversing in depth first search order. So when I go from 9, lowest value of what? Lowest value of the pre counter. Okay, lowest value of the pre counter encountered as I go down. So the lowest value of the pre counter that I encounter when I come to 9 is just 0, because right now it's 0. Pre of 9 is 0. When I come to 6, right, 6 basically has a pre value of 1. The lowest value of pre that I have encountered so far is 1. When I come to 7, the pre value of 7 is 2. The lowest value that I have encountered of pre value of 7 that I encountered up to now is 7 is 2. Here it is 3 here. So when I come to 5 it becomes 3. The pre value of 5 is 3, right? But 5 has a descendant. Which descendant does it have? It has a descendant which is 6. So there is a dotted line going to 6. What is 6's pre value? 6's pre value is 1. So what happens basically is now 5 has a low value of 1. What does 5? Why does 5 have a low value of 1? 5 has a low value of 1 because it encounters in the DFS 6, which has a pre value of 1. Therefore 5 has a low value of 1. Because 5 has a low value of 1, 7 has a low value of 1. Why does 7 have a low value of 1? Because I can go from 7 to 5 to 6, and 6 has a pre value of 1. Okay. Then similarly 6 has a low value of 1 because 6, 7, 5, 6 it has a value. So like that I can draw the low values. Okay, the low values basically is the lowest pre-value I have encountered while doing DFS. So you can see basically that when I go from 9 to 6, 7, 5, 4, 8 and then I come back to 9, what happens basically that 8 gets a low value of 0 because 9 has a pre-value of 0. So this 0 propagates up like this and all of these nodes get a low value of 0, 9 also gets a low value of 0. So basically you have 9 now with a pre-value of 0 and a low value of 0. So a node which basically has a pre-value which is equal to its low value must be the root of a cluster. Does that make sense? Okay, is this clear? I mean, is it becoming clear to you what I am doing here? I am trying to find out whether there is a dotted edge going out of a cluster or not, and I am doing that by keeping track of the low value. Okay, let me do that for 1, 2, 3, right? So when I entered 1, if you remember, when I entered 1, the pre-value was 7. Okay, pre-value was 7. So entered 1, the pre-value was 7. So 7 is the lowest pre-value I encountered so far. Then I go to 2, this one has a pre-value of 8. I go here, this one has a pre-value of 9. Then 3 points back to 1. So 1 has a pre-value of 7. Therefore 3 gets a low value of 7. Therefore 2 gets a low value of 7. Therefore 1 gets a low value of 7. Because 1 has a low value of 7 and 1's pre-value is also 7. Therefore 1 is a node whose low value is equal to its pre-value. Therefore 1 is the root of a cluster. Is that okay? So I can find all the clusters by just keeping an additional counter called low. What does low do? It keeps track of the lowest pre-value I have seen so far, and when you find a node whose low value is equal to pre-value, you print that node as the root of a cluster. So all the clusters can be identified by using DFS simply by keeping this low value. Is that okay? That's a simple note. Do you think this algorithm is very simple? It just uses DFS. It's using a recursive traversal of the graph, keeping track of counters. What counters? Pre-counter, post-counter which you have not used so far, a low counter which keeps track of the lowest pre-counter that I have seen so far. Okay. So as an exercise, I will leave this as an exercise to you. Modify the DFS algorithm, what I showed you, the pseudocode, to keep low values and to print the clusters. Means print the root of the cluster. Don't have to print the clusters, print the root of the cluster. Because once I print the root of the cluster, I can print the cluster because all I have to do is go down the cluster and print all the nodes which have the same low value. All the nodes value all belong to the same. Okay. So I just print the root of the cluster. Alright. So modify the pseudocode of the algorithm I showed you earlier to include this low value counter and to print all the DFS, print all the clusters. Now I can ask, how do I find the cut edge? Okay. How do I find the cut edges? If I want to find this cut edge, how do I find it? And then this basically somehow, if I find that 1 is the root of a cluster, I know that the parent of 1 and 1 just form a cut edge, isn't it? If I found out 1 is the root of a cluster, so the parent of 1 was 4. So 4 to 1, that edge must be a cut edge. It's very simple to find a cut edge. Once I find the root of a cluster, I just take the parent of that root of the cluster, and then the edge joining that parent and that root of the cluster must be a cut edge. So this will also tell me all the cut edges. Okay. So very easy for me to find all the cut edges of the class of the thing. Now I am going to give you an exercise. Think about this exercise in the night. Tomorrow in the class you are going to work this problem out. You are going to work this problem out. Okay. Think about it. Work out your group. Think about the solution to this. How do I find cut vertices? I am not finding cut edges. I am finding cut vertices. Of course, every cut edge contributes to cut vertices. Cut edge means that both the vertices on either side of the cut edge is a cut vertex. But that may not be the only cut vertex you may have in a graph. Okay, you may have other cut vertices. So how do I find cut vertices using DFS? This is the problem. Think about this problem. Try to think of a solution. Tomorrow's class we will work the solution out in the class. We will discuss the solution in the class. Okay. I will give you a few more applications of DFS. Most of it we are going to do in the class tomorrow as problems, but I will just give you a few more applications. Let's go back to directed graphs, right? Directed graphs. So directed graphs basically means the edges are directed. Previously we had undirected graph, which means we did not have, there were no directions. Now I am drawing the direction. So DFS turns out to be much more useful in directed graphs. Okay. But when you have directed graphs, you can classify the edges into 3 categories. First category is what is called a backward edge, okay, and I will basically in the next class I will again revisit this so that we get some more time to think about it because of the exercises we need. So this edge is called a backward edge because it's pointing from 8 to 6. This edge from 9 to 8 is called a forward edge because I have deliberately directed. I put the direction from 9 to 6, 8. This is called a forward edge. And then you can have an edge like this 10 to 7. Of course, this graph, original graph didn't have it. So I've just drawn this edge. This is called a cross edge. So in a directed graph, when you do DFS, you will get these solid lines which are the BFS tree edges, and you will get three kinds of dashed edges. You will get backward dashed edges, you will get forward dashed edges, and you will get this cross dashed edges. So most of the analysis that you will do with graphs when we do DFS traversal involves looking at these kinds of edges. What happens when you encounter a backward dashed edge? What happens when you encounter a forward dashed edge? What happens when you encounter a cross dashed edge? Okay, that's how you do your analysis. So we defined cluster loosely, but now we can define a directed graph. We can define a cluster more formally. We define a cluster basically in a directed graph as something called a strongly connected component. A strongly connected component, abbreviated simply as SCC, strongly connected component, SCC, is a maximal set of vertices U such that for every pair of vertices U, V in the graph, in that U, there is a path from U to V and a path from V to U. Okay, there is for every pair of vertices in the strongly connected component, you can find a path from U to V and you can find a path from V to U. So it's nicely connected in some sense. I can go from U to V and I can go from V to U, which means there's a cycle. U, V, U is a cycle. U, V, U cycle. So every pair of nodes contribute in some sense to a cycle, means that I can make a cycle that goes through all the nodes in the strongly connected component. That's what it means. Okay. So in this graph, for example, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, 5, there is a nice cycle here, but it's not a strongly connected component because it's not maximal. Strongly connected component, firstly they should be like this, cycle must be there, but they should also be maximal. So the maximal thing is 6, 7, 5, 4, 8, 6, 7, 5, 4, 8, because I can go 6, 7, 5, go back to 6, 7, 5, 4, 8, go back to 6, 7, 5, go back to 6, 7, 5, 4, 8, go back like this. Keep doing this, right? So that forms a big cycle. That is why 6, 7, 5, 4, 8 forms a strongly connected component. 9 does not belong to the strongly connected component because while there is a path from 9 to 6, there is no path from 6 to 9. Okay, therefore 9 is not in the strongly connected. So what are the strongly connected components in this graph? Clearly the three strongly connected components are these three. Okay, 9, 10 are strongly connected, 1, 2, 3 are strongly connected, and these are strongly connected. So the question that immediately comes up is, of course, there are many applications of strongly connected components in many different fields. Okay, I'll discuss some of them in the next class, tomorrow's class. But you can ask yourself, what algorithm will find for me using DFS, strongly connected components of the graph, and think about how you can do it with DFS tonight. In tomorrow's class, I'm going to actually ask you to solve this problem in the class. Okay, this is another problem we're going to do in the class tomorrow. Okay, as the last application, we have a few more minutes. I just want to take this last application and we'll stop. We're going to take graphs which are acyclic directed graphs. Acyclic means the graph does not have a cycle. Okay, we saw this graph has cycle, right? There are many cycles in fact. In acyclic graph, there are no cycles. Okay, if there is an acyclic graph, you can do what is called a topological sort of the acyclic graph by ordering all the nodes of the graph in such a way that in the topological sort you will appear before V in the ordering. I just made this definition today. I think we are running out of time. I want to allow you to ask a few questions. So what I'll do is that we will discuss topological sort in tomorrow's class. Okay, we'll discuss it in tomorrow's class so that we can give it more time, alright, and understand it. But what I'll just show you is a topological sort of an acyclic graph can be done using DFS. So you can see that DFS, though it looks stupid and doesn't look very interesting and so on, actually is a very interesting method because it finds all kinds of interesting properties of the graph. It finds out whether the graph is cyclic, whether it's basically whether it is strongly connected. It will find out whether or not there are cut edges, vertices. I can do topological sorting. I can do all that. Okay. with that we'll stop for today's class. We have 3 minutes or something, so I can take maybe 1 or 2 questions for today. Tomorrow, remember, we're going to have 20 or 30 minutes we will spend just on problem solving. You can ask any number of questions tomorrow, including for today's class, but I will take 2 or 3 questions just to sum up today's class. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, it basically means either the material was too easy, you all knew all about it already, in which case tomorrow's class hopefully gets more difficult, or it was too difficult. I mean, it means that my explanation was not good enough and you struggled with thing, but if it even then, hopefully we'll solve problems tomorrow and you will get to understand it better. Okay. So I hope that it was made easier for you by today's class. In tomorrow's class, we will make it much more simpler by, okay, maybe there is a question in chat. Okay, so there is no question. It says, okay, all right. So in tomorrow's class, I am going to basically discuss shortest path problem, Dijkstra's greedy algorithm, going to do Bellman-Ford, which is dynamic programming, and also look at some of these problems which we left open today. So do study these problems carefully and think about how you can find cut vertices in a graph. How do you find out strongly connected components in a graph using DFS? Okay, we will do the problems in class tomorrow with some assistance. Okay, we will be doing it. Okay, thank you all.